Again, this is George and Marina, the Duke and Duchess of Kent, written by Christopher Warwick. This is chapter 13, so there's only 16 chapters, so we're on 13 out of 16. It is about the tragic mystery of Prince George's death and the events that led up to it. So it's a short chapter, so I will get started. Between 25 August 1941, when he visited the NACA laboratory in Norfolk, Virginia, and his death exactly 1 year later, the Duke of Kent had flown more than 60,000 miles on active service with the Royal Air Force. And another 1,800 miles would have been added to his record had his scheduled mission to inspect RAF bases in Iceland had been accomplished according to plan. For the Duke and Duchess, much of August had been taken up, one way or another, with family events. On the 4th, their 1-month-old son, Michael, was christened in the private chapel at Windsor Castle, where, aside from President Roosevelt, his 7 other godparents, King George VI, Queen Wilhelmina of Netherlands, King Haakon VII of Norway, Frederica, hereditary princess of Greece, Victoria, the dowager of Marchioness of Milford Haven, and Lady Patricia Ramsay. They were either present in person or represented by other family members. On the 15th, Cecil Batten drove to Coppins to photograph the proud parents and their baby son, while 2 days earlier, Queen Mary had spent the afternoon with George and Marina. The visit had clearly given her very great pleasure. "The baby is sweet," she noted in her diary later that day. "Had luncheon and tea, walked in the garden. Georgie showed me some of his interesting things. He looked so happy with his lovely wife and dear baby." Not quite 2 weeks later, George, his private secretary, Lieutenant John Lowther, his equerry pilot officer, the Honorable Michael Strutt, and his valet, leading aircraftman John Hales, prepared themselves for a visit to the RAF bases in Iceland. During the late afternoon of 24 August, the Duke said his farewells to Marina before driving himself off to London, where he boarded the overnight train to Inverness. It was the start of something that had its genesis in George's desire to play a more definite and necessary part in the war effort. His friendship with the Roosevelts and with the American-born Nancy, Viscountess Astor, the first woman to sit as a member of the British Parliament, and who had, indeed, introduced him to a number of senior U.S. officers, helped to further his ambitions of working as a liaison officer between the American and British Air Forces. Decisively, his actor friend Douglas Fairbanks Jr., then serving in the U.S. Navy, arranged a meeting between George and the General Carl Toohey Spaatz, the first Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. It was Spaatz who, in May 1942, became the commander of the 8th Air Force and who came up with the suggestion that George should fly to Iceland and, once there, find himself invited to a nearby U.S. base. Spaatz would then officially request George's services as a liaison officer between the British and the American bases. As he stepped off the train at Inverness the following morning, 25 August, George was met by Group Captain Jeffrey Francis, Commanding Officer No. 4, Coastal, Operating Training Unit at Invergordon, which would be the Duke's point of departure. When he arrived at the base, George was introduced to the carefully selected team responsible for flying him to the frozen north, as he referred to his destination. Leading the immensely experienced crew was Flight Lieutenant 42057 Frank Mackenzie Goen of Royal Air Force, 228th Squadron. A 26-year-old Australian who had already flown Sir Stafford Cripps, Britain's ambassador to the Soviet Union to Moscow. He had over 1,000 flying hours on ocean patrols to his credit. As captain, Goyen would fly the lumbering Sunderland flying boat W4026 DQ-M, which had flown from Oban the previous weekend and was now moored on the Cromarty Firth, the surface which looked as smooth as gray slate, as one observer described that day. Sitting next to Frank Goyen on the flight and acting as first pilot would be the wing commander Thomas L. Mosley, the commanding officer of the 228th Squadron. He was attached temporarily to the Sunderland's crew as a courtesy to the aircraft's royal passenger. Completing the flight personnel, all of whom had been personally selected by Mosley, were pilot officer Sidney Wood Smith, the second pilot officer George Sanders, acting as navigator, flight sergeants Charles Lewis, William Jones, and Ernest Hewardine, and sergeants Edward Blacklock, Arthur Catt, and Leonard Sweet. Flight Sergeant Andrew Jack was to act as the rear gunner. On 25 August, while the crew was being briefed, the Duke of Kent and his party took lunch with Group Captain Francis. At about 12:30 p.m., they were ferried out to the aircraft by marine tender. Once aboard, they spent the next half hour or so making the routine pre-flight checks of instruments and generally warming the flying boat up ready for takeoff. At 1 o'clock, the Duke was welcomed on board, and it is thought most likely that he and his staff would have gone straight to the wardroom in the belly of the aircraft. Minutes later, the Sunderland began to move across the waters of the Cromarty Firth, which were so calm that the flying boat needed an unusually long run before finding a wave to help it lift off. Low clouds along the south coast at Caithness that day meant that flying conditions would be poor for the first part of the flight. But the general forecast was favorable, with the clearer weather expected to the north and out over the Atlantic. At 1 p.m., the Sunderland was airborne and flying between the two precipitous headlands at the mouth of the Cromarty Firth, known as the Suitors, turned northeast to follow the coastline. Inland from the east coast village of Barradale, no more than 30 minutes later, David Morrison and his son Hugh were rounding up their flock of sheep when they heard the aircraft approach from the sea. Though because of the dense mists, known in Scotland as har, neither father nor son were able to see it. Then followed the son of an almighty explosion as the Sunderland crashed out on hillside and 2,500 gallons of aviation fuel blew up, sending a wall of flame skyward. On the 15 men on board, all but one was killed. The single badly burned survivor was Andrew Jack, who was the rear gun turret, ironically considered the most dangerous place to be, and had broken off, hurling him into the ground. In the past, several riders had been under the common misapprehension that the Sunderland collided with the Eagle's Rock, an 800-foot promontory of the Duke of Portland's Langwell estate. Others have claimed that it cleared the summit of the rock but plowed into the rising ground beyond. Research indicates that neither assumption is correct. For the aircraft to have encountered Eagle's Rock at all, it would have had to approach the hill from a different direction altogether, probably consistent with flying towards it and not away from it. What the Sunderland had in fact cleared, or had perhaps flown around, was 2,000 was the 2,000-foot summit of Meal Donul, or Donald Summit, so situated at the eastern end of Scarabin, a ridge running east to west and lying south of Eagle's Rock itself. Having cleared Donald's Mount, however, and for some inexplicable reason, in the thick mist and hazardous terrain, the plane descended to an altitude of only 700 feet and thundered straight into the gently sloping hill which, at its western extreme, rises to Eagle's Rock. At the sound of the explosion, Hugh Morrison sprinted downhill to the track where he left his motorcycle and sped to the little community of Braymore to raise the alarm. He then rode on the coastal village of Dunbeath to alert the local physician, Dr. Kennedy, and the police. Immediately, the first search party set out from Braymore, northeast of the site of the crash, while crofters and gillies who had heard the news set out from Berrydale. Later that afternoon, the search parties discovered the wreckage and the bodies. From his house in Dunbeath, the elderly Dr. Kennedy and two special constables, one of whom was William Bethune, hastened to the scene. Both Kennedy and Bethune identified the Duke of Kent's body. Still clad in his flying suit, despite a severe gash to the head, his features were clearly discernible, though the inscription of his identity bracelet left nobody in any doubt. It read, His Royal Highness, the Duke of Kent, the Coppins, Ivor, Buckinghamshire. At Coppins that evening, when the telephone rang, Marina had not long gone to her bedroom. Intending to have an early night, Kate Fox, who had nursed the Duchess as a baby 36 years earlier, and who had come out of retirement to help with the 7-week-old Prince Michael, took the call. Numb with shock, and no doubt wondering just how best to break the news, she slowly climbed the stairs. Hearing her old nurse's reluctant tread, it is said that Marina immediately sensed disaster, and the moment Foxy opened the door, cried out, It's George, isn't it? At Balmoral, where members of the royal family were on holiday, the King and Queen were having dinner with Harry and Alice, the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, when the steward entered the dining room and whispered to the King that Sir Archibald Sinclair, Secretary of State for Air, was on the telephone and needed to speak with him urgently. When he rejoined his family, George VI was grim-faced and silent. The news, he later confided to his diary, came as a great shock to me, and I had to break it to Elizabeth and Harry and Alice, who were staying with us. We left Balmoral in the evening for London. When the King was called from the table, the Duchess of Gloucester first thoughts were of Queen Mary. She thought something had happened to her. In fact, the 75-year-old Queen Dowager, who spent the war years with her niece Mary, the Duchess of Beaufort, and her husband at Badminton House in Gloucestershire, had spent the day in active high spirits. During the morning, she had driven over to Lord Methune's country house, Corsham Court, once owned by two of Henry VIII's wives, Catherine of Aragon and Catherine Parr, to attend a lecture and visit a picture gallery. She had then spent the rest of the wet afternoon at Badminton putting photographs into her huge scarlet folio albums, and after tea had sat at her needlework while Lady Cynthia Colville, one of her ladies-in-waiting, read to her. News of Georgie's death was received shortly after dinner. I felt so stunned by the shock, Queen Mary wrote in her diary. I couldn't believe it because of the close relationship she had always shared with her fourth son. The king's immediate thoughts were of his mother. On her part, Queen Mary's first thoughts were of her daughter-in-law. I must go to Marina tomorrow, she said, and the following morning she climbed into her famous old Daimler and drove to Coppens. When she arrived, she found Marina in a pitiful and desolate state, one moment sobbing uncontrollably, the next staring blankly into space, utterly motionless. As the disaster made headline news around the world, tributes to Prince George flooded in from Australia, where Parliament was adjourned as a mark of respect. Premier John Curtin said that Australians had always highly regarded the Duke, whose designation for the Governor-Generalship had evoked real pleasure. In Victoria, the Greek community prepared a message of condolence for the Duchess, in which they expressed their appreciation of the fact that Prince George had been a staunch supporter of our beloved and suffering country. From Canada, Prime Minister Mackenzie King said of the Duke, I greatly admired him for his public service and his attractive personality. Further tributes were received from the presidents, governor generals, and prime ministers of New Zealand, South Africa, Portugal, Argentina, and China, while in the United States, Senator Tom Connolly, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said, the Duke of Kent's brave conduct will serve as an inspiration to his gallant comrades in the armies and navies of the United Nations. More private messages were sent to the royal family by those who had ties of personal friendship. In a telegram to the widowed Duchess, President Roosevelt said, I am shocked beyond measure at hearing of the tragic accident, and I want you to know that I feel the loss very deeply and personally. He has given his life for his nation, and in great cause. I'm thinking much of you and the babies. In response, Marina wired, am deeply touched by your kind and understanding sympathy and your appreciation of my beloved husband. I am heartbroken. To Queen Mary, Roosevelt cabled, may I tell you of my great sorrow in hearing of this tragic accident to your gallant boy. While to the king, his message read, I feel that I have lost an old and true friend, and I want you to know how heartsick I am at this tragic accident. My wife and I are thinking much of all of you. Other friends were no less stunned. Noel Coward, who had many reasons for remembering Prince George with particular affection, wrote in his diary on the 26th of August, a dreadful morning. Headlines in the papers saying the Duke of Kent was killed yesterday afternoon in an air crash. I can hardly believe it, but of course that is nonsense because I believe it only too well. It is never difficult to believe that someone young and charming and kind is dead. They are always dying. Well, there goes a friendship of 19 years. I shall miss him most horribly. He may have had his faults, but he was kind always, and I feel absolutely miserable. I am taking this resentfully and personally. I am so deeply sorry for the poor Duchess. I wrote to her this morning, of course, a rather inarticulate letter. In memoriam, I say, thank you for your friendship for me all of these years, and I shall never forget you. In Scotland, on the 27th of August, the body of 39-year-old Duke contained in an oak coffin draped with the blue flag of the RAF was taken to Dunrobin Castle, seat of the Duke of Sutherland, where aircraft men had mounted an all-night vigil to the local railway station. There, the London-bound train made an extra stop, and as the guard of honor presented arms and a crowd of local people wept openly, the coffin was borne to a special carriage and placed next to those of some of the Sunderland's other victims. Later that day, conveyed in a canvas-topped military ambulance, the Duke's remains were taken by road from Euston Station to Windsor Castle, where they were placed in the ornate marble-walled Albert Memorial Chapel, near the tombs of two more princes who had died far too young. Queen Mary's first fiancé, Eddie, Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence and Avondale, and Queen Victoria's eighth child and youngest son, Prince Leopold, the Duke of Albany. When Marina arrived at the chapel shortly afterwards, clutching a small bunch of red and white roses which she had cut from bushes grown by Prince George in the garden of Coppins, she asked to be left entirely alone. Outside, in the Galilee porch, a stone passage that separates the Albert Memorial from St. George's Chapel, the Duchess lady-in-waiting, Lady Herbert, waited for her altogether with officers of the Grenadier Guards. The next day she returned, a solitary black veiled figure in the midst of a mass of color. The chapel floor paved with veined marbles and various hues, the walls covered with panels of colored marble designed by Baron Henry de Trichetti, depicting scenes from the Old Testament, and the vaulted roof gilded and set with Venetian glass mosaic, all outward expressions of an earlier inconsolable grief, that of Queen Victoria for her 42nd-year-old husband, Prince Albert. The funeral of Prince George, the Duke of Kent, took place in the cathedral like St. George's Chapel, dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary, St. George, and St. Edward the Confessor, in the morning of Saturday, the 29th of August. Supported by the Queen and the Queen Mary, Marina was escorted to her place opposite the purple catafalque near the high altar. Having come from the Albert Memorial Chapel, the cortege entered St. George's to the hymn, "Abide with Me," now draped with the Duke's personal standard, on which was placed his Air Commodore's cap, together with Princess Marina's wreath of a multitude of garden flowers arranged on a base of George's favorite clove carnations. The coffin was borne on the shoulders of 4 vice-marshals and 2 air marshals. Preceded by the Dean of Windsor, Dr. Bailey, and by his equerries, Lieutenant Colonel Humphrey Butler and Captain Lord Herbert, who carried the Duke's insignia on crimson velvet cushion. The procession made its way along the nave and passing through the fan-vaulted organ screen in the choir. As it approached, Marina's gaze never left her husband's gold-braided cap until the coffin was set down on the catafalque. She then knelt in prayer, and but for the moment when the Duke's titles were proclaimed by Garter of the King's Arms, she remained kneeling throughout the service. At the end, the Queen held her arm as she paused to look down into the open space into which her husband's coffin had descended into the royal vault. Then, as the organ played Chopin's Funeral March, followed by Christian Sinding's Intermezzo No. 1, a favorite piece of the Duke's, Marina was led from St. George's. I have attended very many family funerals in the chapel, King George VI wrote, but none have moved me in the same way. For Noel Coward, the service was impressive and supremely dignified. I tried hard not to cry, but it was useless. When the Duchess came in, I broke a bit, and when the coffin passed with flowers from the garden at the Coppins and Prince George's cap on it, I was finished. After it was all over, the king had sprinkled the earth and the royalties had gone away. We all went up one by one to the vault and bowed and secretly said goodbye to him. Then we went out into the very strong sunlight. Margaret Oxford, the Countess of Oxford and Asquith, came up to me and said, "Very well done, wasn't it?" As though she had been at a successful first night. I thought this offensive and unforgivable. By the time Queen Mary left Windsor to drive back to Badminton that afternoon, a fearful thunderstorm had broken. Yet for the grand old dowager, the journey was not without diversion, and for a moment her private sorrow was interrupted when she gave a lift, as she frequently did, to a charming young American parachutist who was most friendly, and to a nice sergeant observer from the Royal Air Force. Within a few days, Queen Mary had resumed what she called her wooding activities, which meant sawing up logs and even trees in the ground surrounding Badminton House. "I'm so glad I can take up my occupation again," she said. "Georgie would have wished me to do so." On the 14th of September, 3 weeks after the crash, George VI drove from Balmoral to Berrydale to visit the site of his brother's death. By the time of his arrival, most of the wreckage had already been removed. But only time and nature could erase every sign of the aircraft's devastating path. The ground, for 200 yards long and 100 yards wide, had been scored and scorched by its trail and by flame. It hit one side of the slope, turned over in the air, and slid down the other side on its back. The impact must have been terrific, as the aircraft was an aircraft. The impact must have been terrific, and the aircraft, as an aircraft, was unrecognizable when found. What exactly happened in the afternoon on Tuesday, 25 August 1942? Some 30 minutes after takeoff remains one of the great mysteries in aviation history. Despite the fact that Prince George was one of the most important public figures to die in a wartime crash, a full examination of the tragedy has never emerged, and the same baffling question inevitably confronts those who probe the disaster. How could such an experienced crew, at their most alert, have made such a fatal error as to descend into a low cloud when the established procedure under such conditions was to gain altitude? Among those who made an in-depth study of the crash and its possible causes was the writer and broadcaster Robin McWhirter, who, during investigation for his BBC radio program The Crash of W4026, transmitted in August 1985, interviewed a number of people who remembered the crash or who were in some way connected with it. They included Hugh Morrison, William Bethune, and Jean Auld, a sister of the sole survivor, Andrew Jack. He subsequently met Group Captain Francis, who had been the commanding officer of Invergordon. As Robert McWhirter and others were to discover when examining the disaster, all documents pertaining to the official court of inquiry have apparently and remarkably vanished into thin air. The National Archives, Public Record Office, the RAF Historical Branch, and the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle all deny having possession of the key records relating directly to the death not of some obscure, insignificant princeling, but of the Duke of Kent, a senior ranking member of the royal family, brother of the king, and at times fifth in line to the throne. To compound the mystery still further, the discovery that the flight briefing had also disappeared again apparently without trace, means the route Flight Lieutenant Goyen and Wing Commander Mosley were instructed to follow remains open to conjecture. In an article published in the Quarterly Review after the battle, David J. Smith, like Ralph Barker, author of The Great Mysteries of the Air, it points to Sunderland having been instructed to take what might seem to be the most obvious route. That is to say, to follow the coastline in a northeasterly direction for some 80 to 85 miles, keeping out of cover the North Sea and turning through the Pentland Firth. Of course, for Reykjavik, the Iceland capital. This, however, is by no means the only route to the fated Sunderland. The RAF personnel have explained that it was far more unusual for aircraft to gain a safe altitude of 4,000 feet over the Moray Firth, then turn inland at Dunbeath to fly over the predominantly flat landscape of Caithness to the Pentland Firth. Having interviewed local people who remembered the accident, Robert McWhorter suggested that the Duke of Kent's aircraft flew up the coast and crossed inland at a point known as the Needle, just south of Barradie's Whale, and then flew south up the wide river valley. Then it cleared Donald's Mount at the eastern end of Scarabin and was heading north for the Pentland Firth when disaster struck. Over the years, there have been many theories about the cause of the crash itself and why the Sunderland should have been flying as low as 700 feet at the time of impact. These have ranged from the effects of downdraft on the aircraft or the influence of magnetic rocks on its compasses to plane sabotage. Some of the suggestions seem plausible enough, while others were little more than pure fantasy. In the late 1930s, before the outbreak of the war, King George VI, like countless other men and women of every class who had lived through the Great War, enthusiastically supported Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policies of appeasement. To that end, the king had recruited the Duke of Kent with his intimate family links, especially in Germany, where several relations were Nazi sympathizers, and indeed members of the Nazi Party. He was an ideal emissary, uniquely placed, as one observer put it, to act as an intermediary between high-ranking Nazis and the movers and shakers of British society for the betterment of Anglo-German relations. With that in mind, it is perhaps unsurprising that the lexicon of theories surrounding George of Kent's fatal flight 3 years into the war included a suggestion, and there are other similar scenarios that have picked him up on a remote Scottish loch. The Duke and Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, were en route to Sweden as part of a top-secret mission to broker a negotiated peace. Theories aside, however, on 7 October 1942, Sir Archibald Sinclair, the Secretary of State for Air, reported the findings of the Special Court of Inquiry to the House of Commons. According to the extract published in the Hansard, the court found, first, that the accident occurred because the aircraft was flown on a track other than that indicated in the flight plan given to the pilot, and it was too low in altitude to clear the rising ground of the track. Secondly, the responsibility of this serious mistake lies with the airmanship and with the captain of the aircraft. Thirdly, the weather encountered should have presented no difficulties to an experienced pilot. Fourthly, the examination of the propellers showed that the engines were under power when the aircraft struck the ground. And fifthly, all occupants of the aircraft were on duty at the time of the accident. In his article, The Tragedy at Eagles Rock, it was published in The Scotsman in August 1985. To complement transmission of his radio program, Robert McWhorter reacted to the claim that the accident was entirely the captain's fault by saying, "If Skipper Frank Goyen made such an elementary error in failing to seek altitude and bad visibility, he wasn't alone in making the decision." Wing Commander T.L. Mosley, the CO of the 228th Squadron, was seated beside him as first pilot for his special trip. Goyen also had a second pilot, a navigator, and 7 other men, engineers, radio operators, gunners, watching what he was doing. All were men of experience. All were men who valued their lives. And that was the story of Prince George's death.